This is the Voice of Russia, broadcasting from the heart of London. From Monday to Friday, we're live here on digital from 4 p.m. until 8. We're also online at ruvr.co.uk. Tune in for current affairs, news, arts and debate.
Welcome to Voice of Russia's new political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Here in Russia, May 9th is a sacred day, a day of sorrow and great pride. 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives in that war. The destruction of Nazi Germany and its fascist allies is something that strongly binds Russian society to this day. Welcome to Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. To talk about Victory Day and the Second World War, my guests in London join me. John Barber, he's a fellow and lay dean at King's College, Cambridge. And we have Jonathan Gumz, lecturer of modern history at the University of Birmingham. And sitting here with me in Moscow in Voice of Russia's studio is Sergei Lebedev. He's an independent military analyst. Okay, John, if I can go to you first. Today is marking the 68th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, May 9th. And in Russia, there's a huge parade in Red Square, and all across of Russia, there are celebrations. I'd like to point out to our listeners that yesterday was Victory Day in Western Europe and in the United States. It was hardly mentioned in the press. Why the difference, John?
I think that's a reflection of the fact that the victory on the Eastern Front, that was the great achievement of the Soviet Union, although it was in alliance with the Western powers, with the United States and with Great Britain, was a victory in which the Soviet Union played really the overwhelming part. And for this reason, while the acknowledgement that this was a very significant role that the Soviet Union had in the West, much more emphasis is put on specific victories, and in, of course, the final victory over Japan later in 1945. But as a whole, and as you rightly observe, Victory Day in Europe is virtually a non-event, apart, of course, from those veterans who are still alive and who participated in the war.
Jonathan, historians can debate it, okay, but let's just say that the Second World War, Nazi Germany was defeated essentially by the Soviet Union with the assistance of Western allies. But that's not politically correct to say in the West, I suppose.
No, it's not politically correct to say in the West. I think though in broader circles, I think that's largely an accepted fact. But in the realm of commemoration and remembrance, I think
how about popular culture?
Right.
Popular culture as well.
Where there's a different war that's remembered on the American side or on the British side than what's remembered on the Soviet side. I think if you think of kind of even marginal kind of professional historians, they would say that the overwhelming contribution, at least to the defeat of German military power, comes from the Soviet Union.
Sergei, it's again we've just discussed the differences. I mean, as a Russian, as a military analyst, I mean, explain how people feel about the war. It's 68 years ago, okay, and let's say the truth, gentlemen. There are fewer and fewer veterans as the years go by. Sergei.
So I would like, first of all, to say hello to John and to Jonathan. Hi, gentlemen.
Hi.
Hello.
And Peter, I would say that you've placed our colleagues into a very awkward position.
Didn't mean to. Go ahead, Sergei.
Even now, after 68 years, the gentlemen do not want to openly confess that actually the Soviet Union made a very serious contribution, and the Western society should know about this. But
well, why is it, Sergei? And gentlemen, John and Jonathan, is it because it was the communist Soviet Union? Was it because of Stalin? I mean, these are issues here. John, speak to that, okay? I mean, it's a political issue, too. It's just not historical.
It's a political issue, but it's the legacy of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Because during the war, of course, the great contribution of the Red Army to fighting the Wehrmacht and to defeating, ultimately, Nazi Germany was recognized. And the population, certainly of Britain, and I'm sure of America, were well aware of the massive contribution that the Soviet population was making, both combatants and civilians, to the defeat of Nazi Germany. It was after the war, and as part and parcel of the Cold War, that this awareness and, if you like, this memory was to a considerable extent suppressed.
You know, Jonathan, you're from Milwaukee, aren't you?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I'm an American too. I don't want to betray my age on air here, but how was I brought up? My father fought in the Second World War. He fought at Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Okay, so I was brought up hearing about the Pacific War. I heard almost nothing about the Red Army's contribution. I heard about Pearl Harbor. And what I'm trying to get at here for our listeners, there's nothing wrong with that. I suppose Britain has the Battle of Britain. Okay, we have Pearl Harbor, and well, the Soviets have 4 years of bloodshed. Okay, isn't this really kind of normal? Even if we take the Cold War element out, it's where you fought.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, I would say it's normal. I think in the other sense, it's also a kind of reflection of, in a way, the weakness of kind of elements of Soviet historiography on the war that was kind of passed over by virtue of the fact that the Cold War was actually going on, and therefore, Soviet historiography was directed towards a kind of political end. And so therefore you have a much less developed literature of the Soviet side of the war. Even today, that literature is much less developed. You can compare it to the German side. And so therefore, I think in a way, if you think of the popular image of the war kind of arising, in a sense, out of a kind of established historiographical literature, I mean, you have a much weaker element of that on the Soviet side. And, of course, we have to remember that the Soviet Union for a long time was a largely closed society, and there wasn't that interest, in a way, in kind of moving out a kind of professional historical debate, it strikes me, during the Cold War. So in a sense, I think, in a way, our memory of what's happening in the war will gradually encompass the Soviet side as Russian historiography of the war, helped in part by the massive German historiography of the Eastern Front, will develop further. So in a way, I think it's understandable, but it's changing.
Okay. It's really interesting. When I was growing up, again, looking at historiography, I remember there was a documentary called The Forgotten War, and it was about the Soviet contribution to the Second World War. And I mean, in retrospect, and I was trained as a historian, I mean, how in the world could you talk about the Soviet contribution as the Forgotten War? Sergei, let's turn it upside down. Are Russians well aware of Western contributions to victory over fascism, over Nazi Germany and Japan? Do they know about it? Because, we're being critical on one side, but can we be critical on the other side?
Well, absolutely. And I can tell you that I'm talking about the majority of the population. And this majority really values the contribution made by the Western countries. And everybody values the fact of opening of the Second Front.
Well, let's speak. LendLease is one thing that's made. I mean, do you think the average Russian, through popular media, knows that the West gave LendLease to the Soviet Union?
My generation knows that
What
perfectly.
about the younger one?
The younger, yes, some of them are very much interested in what was happening at that time, but I would say those reforms which took place in Russia in 1990s affected, of course, the young generation, but now things are changing, and again, more and more interest we see on behalf of the young generation concerning the Second World War.
This is Voice of Russia, and you're listening to Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. John, you were going exactly where I want to go here. In 1991, the Soviet Union goes away, okay? And now some of the files are opening up, the archives are opening up. And we heard, again, I was trained as an historian. Now it was more publicly talked about Stalin's behavior in the first few weeks of the war. Not one step back. The brutality at times in the Red Army. What I'm trying to get at is that during the Cold War, we had kind of a black and white historiography. It's getting more complex now as we go into the archives.
Oh, it certainly is, yes. And as you say, from the very top and the vacillations in the high elites, and particularly Stalin himself at the very beginning of the war, right down to what was happening in the grassroots, whether it was the mass executions of people for cowardice and desertion. We now know from the archives that just in the first summer months of 1941, 10,000 Red Army soldiers were executed as an example to their fellow troops. And we now know much more about the suffering of the civilian population. And obviously the population of Leningrad, where nearly 1 million people died essentially of starvation, but elsewhere in the Soviet Union, where huge numbers of people either died from starvation or were seriously undernourished with very lasting effects. And these things are coming out of the archives and do, as my colleague said a little while ago, enable a much more realistic picture of the war to be compiled and for people to get their bearings on what really did happen in the Soviet Union during World War II.
Jonathan, I think it's quite interesting because I'm fascinated with the history of the Second World War, particularly in the East, is that after the end of the war in 1945, the Communist Party legitimized their rule, in my opinion, until it collapsed in 1991 by winning. They won the war. But I think now as we go further and further away from it, it's the peoples of the Soviet Union, irrespective of Stalin. They won it despite Stalin and bad decision-making. It's a people's victory.
Well, yes, it's in a sense a people's victory, but it's also, I think, increasingly, as John mentioned, with a view towards what's being found in the archives. I think we're increasingly realizing that viewing it as a kind of pure Soviet victory, even Soviet peoples, is more and more difficult. That in a sense, the Soviet Union at one level had to conduct war against its own citizens in order to win this war against Germany in a lot of ways.
It's very complicated. It's extremely complicated because you have a collapsed state in the East, and then there's people that are very critical to this day of the relationship before 1941. I'm looking at the treaty in 1939, the Nazi-Soviet treaty, which the Soviet Union is still criticized historically speaking wise, but it's a lot more complex than people, because again, that's politics.
Well, yes, of course, and again, I'm addressing this question to the colleagues with whom we are talking now. The United States never fought against the enemy on its own territory. You try to imagine that near, let's say, New York, 10 German divisions are advancing, and your troops are leaving their positions. What would you do to stop them? Let's remember this horrible terrorist attack on New York, on Manhattan, on September 11th. And the death of 3,000 people in those towers absolutely changed the life of the United States of America. And can't you just imagine that Russia lost almost 27 million on the battlefield and in civilian lives? Do you think it will also change the minds of the people and create the feeling of insecurity, which will definitely affect the foreign policy of the Soviet Union?
John, you want to address that?
Oh, I think Sergei's point is absolutely valid, and one can see this both in the psychology of the Soviet leadership in the decades after the war and in the mentality of the Soviet population and its willingness to really take the leadership of the party and government, which, after all, had defended them in the war. And I think that the other side of the point that Sergei's made is that the ability of either the American or the British population to endure the hardships and to make the kind of contribution to the war effort that the Soviet population made, I think is just very hard to imagine. I mean, quite frankly, had, say, Britain been invaded and occupied, I've no doubt that while there would have been heroic resistance, as Churchill was calling for, but there would also have been collaborators, there would have been those who betrayed the interests of Britain. And in the same sort of way as within the Soviet Union, and as Jonathan mentioned, there were those who went over to the other side, who fought with the Germans or collaborated in other ways. That pattern would have been repeated, I'm sure, in Britain, if not in America, which is a hypothetical.
It's very interesting, as many people make the comparisons between the way the war was fought in the West and the East. And Jonathan, very often the Nazis really weren't interested in collaborators. They just, because of their race theories, just a war of annihilation. I mean, it was very different than the war in the West. Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, in some ways, they weren't interested in collaborators, but they ended up getting a lot of collaborators despite this. And I think that's the kind of fascinating question about this. I mean, even if you look at just the question of Soviet POWs that eventually work for the Wehrmacht, I mean, late 44 or late 43, early 44, the Wehrmacht has 1 million Soviet volunteers, so-called, working for it in the Wehrmacht. I mean,
but let's be clear. To stay alive, or because they believed any kind of political message, or was this because they wanted to get home?
Well, I mean, I think it's oftentimes a kind of combination of both. I mean, in a sense, perhaps an element of politics, especially with regard to soldiers that are from kind of the Soviet Western territories, who might have been nationalist influence, so on and so forth, but also, to survive, but just to kind of be able to get that number of people inside the Wehrmacht is a kind of a stunning testimony to just the way in which the Soviet Union almost fell apart underneath this war, but then somehow came back together again.
It's very interesting you mention that, because I've talked to many historians, and this is to Sergei. The people will criticize the Stalin's purges for good reason, collectivization, and in the perils of that. But by 1941, the best political system that actually could have fought off the Nazi onslaught was the system that Stalin made, because it was so, top down. It was, in a very authoritarian society. In a very odd way, that could be true.
Yes, but again, there arises a matter and a question about the price. This structure cost too much. And I'm sure if it wasn't for the October Revolution in 1917, the Second World War wouldn't happen. For Russia would be strong enough, anybody could challenge it.
What did Stalin say? Was it in 1931, 32? If we have 10 years, and if we're not prepared, they will crush us.
Something like this, yeah. But as far as, let's say, this system which Stalin created, I can tell you about the letters from my grandfather, who was fighting at the front line as a commander of the self-propelled gun mount. He wrote letters before he died. He was killed in the battle in 1944 on the border with Eastern Prussia. Now it is Lithuania. And in these letters, he never mentioned the name of Stalin. He always talked about his friends, comrades, soldiers, about motherland, and not a single word.
Well, that goes back to what I'm saying. It's a people's war. I mean,
it's a people's war. And the name of Stalin was just a kind of a symbol and nothing else. And even now, the debate is going on whether to return the name of Stalingrad to Volgograd, which was renamed. And some people are fearing that that will again put Stalin on the very high.
I think, gentlemen, I'd like to ask you all back to do a special program on Stalin because it's such a big topic. I have to jump in here. This is Voice of Russia, and you're listening to Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. I want to change gears a little bit here. John, wants some umbrage from Russia's side over the last few years is how there's still veterans, fascist veterans that march in the Baltic republics. How do you look at that? I mean, for someone like Sergei, if I can speak for him here, it's insulting, and it is for tens of millions of Russians to see people wearing uniforms marching around with swastikas on their border.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the feeling of horror at seeing the memorials to collaborationists like Bandera and the reunions of the SS divisions from one or other of the post-Soviet republics, that is totally offensive. But what it reflects is the way that history is, as it's often been said, the most political of all the sciences, of all the disciplines, and it shows the way in which history is used and exploited and distorted for political ends. And I think the sort of phenomena that you're describing really is an expression of the extreme nationalism that has, in places and in different forms, emerged in the post-Soviet context. And the celebration of collaborationists is serving political ends. It has nothing to do with history, but it has a lot to do with the nationalist aspirations of certain sections of the ruling class in those countries.
Jonathan, if you could speak to the same point here, and I'd like to add here is, again, looking at from the Russian perspective, I mean, these are EU countries that talk about lofty values about democracy and the strength of civil society and et cetera, et cetera. And again, if you're sitting on the other side of the fence, I mean, how can the European Union talk about these great ideals and hopes, and when they have within their own backyard, within their own borders, people that wave flags and celebrate Nazi collaboration?
Well, I mean, it certainly seems to conflict with many of the values of the EU, but I think it speaks to really your first question about the memory of the war, that there's this terribly conflicted memory of what the war actually was, right? And there's that memory on the Western side, there's that memory in places like Lithuania or Estonia, and there's that memory in the Soviet Union. And in a sense, I mean, I think it's going back through this conflicted memory to the actual war itself that will allow us to kind of see what actually was happening in this incredibly complex conflict that was going on the Eastern Front, in a way far more complex than the conflicts going on in France in 1944, for instance.
Sergei, you want to jump in?
Yeah, you mentioned some problems with the rising elements of fascism in the Baltic countries, for example, but my family was trying to find the place where my grandfather was killed in 1944, and it so happened that with the help of the database memorial, which was initiated by the Defense Ministry of Russia, I found the place, and I went there, and that was in Lithuania. And it was a very small township, and the simple Lithuanian people, they were very friendly. They helped to find the place and even gave me the flowers to put on the grave. And actually, I also requested to put the name on this marble plate, and it was done the day before yesterday. I received the letter that this has been done, and our family is celebrating this V-Day with joy and happiness that we found the place.
Well, then history continued to go on even after 68 years. John, do you think, let's go, because, I'm an American, and, the Civil War that ended in 1865 in the United States, it wasn't until approximately the 1930s where there was a kind of a consensus of what that conflict was about, North and South. Of course, there'll be people always will have differences, but kind of like a general history that most people could agree with. Do you think, how long is it going to take for us to get that kind of consensus in this part of the world? So many different people, so many different tragedies, so many different histories. When do you think we'll get some kind of consensual history about what happened 68 and what ended 68 years ago?
I think it'll be after those who were engaged in the war have passed away, but also, in a way, the next generation, those who grew up in the Cold War and whose attitudes were very much influenced by the Cold War. And I think it'll be another 2 or 3 generations before it's possible to look really objectively at a popular level as well as at an expert level at the war and its consequences.
Jonathan, what do you think about that? That's interesting.
I mean, I think I really agree with John in that sense, but in a way, I doubt that we'll ever be able to get to a real consensus about the war itself, about the kind of the actual events on the ground. Maybe one can agree on, but in terms of how one emphasizes certain elements of the war, what one kind of ignores, what one emphasizes, what one kind of portrays in a particular way. If you look at Tim Snyder's book on Bloodlands, which is far more in many ways of a kind of Polish perspective on the war. I mean, I think in a way what makes this such a fascinating subject is that there won't be consensus on it.
It's a very interesting point here. All righty, gentlemen, I'm going to give Sergei the last word here. What is your family going to be celebrating today on the 9th?
As I mentioned, we found the place where our grandfather was killed and buried, and we will commemorate this victory with actually with grief and joy. At the same time, I would like to congratulate all veterans in the Western Hemisphere with this remarkable occasion, and I hope the day will come and we will become again allies. Thank you.
Okay. And what about your children? Do they know the same history of your family lineage in the war?
Well, my daughter is 35. She knows a lot about history, and she's very proud of her father. My father also fought. He is a colonel. He also fought in the Second World War as a soldier. And as I told you, my grandfather, who was killed in 1944, so my younger generation, they know history of my country.
So they will pass it down through the generations.
Think so.
Thank you very much,
Yes,
Sergei.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for a fascinating discussion here on Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle, and please stay with Voice of Russia.